Good evening and welcome to our webinar focused on the importance of clinical trials. I am Cindy Gavin, Founding Executive Director of Let's Win Pancreatic Cancer, and we are excited that you could join us this evening. Thank you again to our moderator and BRCA advocate, Erika Stallings, and to our panelists, Rob Weker, Randy Swan, and Dr. Jose Trevino. We're incredibly grateful for your support of this program. For those of you who are new to Let's Win, we were born in 2016 as an online platform to connect doctors, patients, and researchers with the latest science-driven information on the best treatment options for pancreatic cancer. Our stories are published each week in both English and in Spanish, and we are reviewed. Everything that we publish is reviewed by a medical expert. And now I would like to turn over the program to our moderator and my friend, Erika Stallings. Erika is an attorney, a writer, and an amazing patient advocate for BRCA-related causes, and she is committed to increasing awareness of hereditary cancers in the Black community. Erika is also the founding co-chair of the Baxter Center's Young Leadership Council and a partner on Black and BRCA initiative. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Erika.
Cindy, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here. This has been one of many incredible webinars that Let's Win has done this year. And as Cindy mentioned, the reason that I really love moderating and being a part of the series is just because we know that one, cancer takes such an impact on people's lives, and then that is compounded by the racial disparities that we see in the cancer space. So I always feel very honored to have the opportunity to be able to do this. So just to get us started this evening, you'll see we're gonna have a quick poll, and we'd love to have our attendees weigh in. Which of these statements about pancreatic cancer clinical trials is true? Take a second and vote. And we will come back a little bit later in the presentation to let you know which one is correct. One of the reasons we've been doing this series this year is that pancreatic cancer really seems to be everywhere. You know, in the past year or so, we have seen pancreatic cancer take the lives of some very prominent Americans as well as Canadians, including John Lewis, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Alex Trebek. We also know that the occurrence of pancreatic cancer, i.e. the amount of cases that are being diagnosed, is also increasing. We have some statistics up here on the slide, but really quickly, according to the most recent information we have, about 60,000 people are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer each year. The average occurrence rate is about 12.9%, but in the Black community, the rate is a little bit higher at 15.7%. The current 5-year survival rate is only 10%, and that's due to the fact that most people are diagnosed when the disease has progressed to a more advanced stage. The most effective treatment is surgical removal of the pancreas, but most patients are diagnosed at a stage where that treatment is not available. And compounding all of this is that currently we do not have an easy screening test for pancreatic cancer. So let's come back and look at the poll results. And actually, this is really interesting. So 89% of you said that researchers must follow strict rules to make sure participants are safe. 56% of participants said that the treatments given as part of a clinical trial do not cost extra to the patient. 78% of you said that all patients can apply to participate in clinical trials, but not everyone qualifies. And finally, 67% of respondents said that participants are closely monitored for any health changes. So actually, all of these answers are correct. Because pancreatic cancer is very difficult to treat, clinical trials are a very important part of the treatment process. And just to give people a little bit of background about clinical trials, not everyone will qualify for every trial, and trials will often target specific stages of disease. Patients may or may not have had prior treatment prior to enrollment in a clinical trial, and there is always the chance that a participant may or may not be able to tolerate the treatment that is being evaluated in that clinical trial. It's also important to know that there is not an extra charge or fee associated with the clinical trial enrollment, although there may be associated expenses such as ancillary testing that has to be conducted, as well as extra missed time from work. And it is really important to note that we really need to test new treatments on everyone. And it is really important to have diversity in clinical trials and make sure that we're including people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds to make sure that the new treatments that we are developing, right, will have a benefit for everyone, which is something that the medical industry has not always done a good job of doing. But this evening, I'm very excited. We're joined by an expert panel from both the patient and scientific perspective to give us a little bit more information about clinical trials. On our panel this evening, we have Randall Swan, who is an 8-year stage 2 pancreatic cancer survivor from Reading, Pennsylvania. He participated in a clinical trial and still receives boosters of his cancer vaccine. And he is also a patient advocate for the Pancreatic Cancer Collective. Next, we have Robert Weker, who is a 7-year stage 2 pancreatic cancer survivor from Philadelphia, who also participated in a clinical trial and also serves as a patient advocate for the Pancreatic Cancer Collective. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Jose Trevino, an associate professor and chair of the Division of Surgical Oncology at Macy Cancer Center at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. His research includes a focus on diversity in clinical trials. And to start our conversation this evening, I'm going to call Randy and Rob to the virtual stage and have a little bit of some conversation and dialogue about how they chose to participate in why they chose to participate in a clinical trial, and how they actually found the trials that they participated in. So a question I would love to ask both of you is that you were both able to undergo a Whipple procedure to remove the tumors that you had. But for each of you, could you share with the audience about how you actually even started looking for clinical trials?
So I guess I'll go first, Erika, and thank you for the question, and thank you for having us here this evening. I guess for me, my journey's slightly different because pancreatic cancer was sort of my third diagnosis for cancer. So I had sort of had that experience previously of the oh no cancer and was very attuned and to addressing what I was facing. And once I sort of heard about pancreatic cancer and did a little bit of research and found out the 5-year survival rates, it had my attention. When you're looking at 5-year survival rates of under 10%, I think you take sort of a different attitude and different approach. So while I was aggressive in my previous cancer treatments as well, I really focused on driving the clinical aspect and what was available for pancreatic. So again, as you mentioned, since I was Whipple eligible, I was very focused on finding, the right surgeon. But a very close 1A for me was to find the trial that would meet my needs.
Yeah. Randy, how about you? How did you find the trial that you're currently involved with?
Well, I mean, how did I know even to look for a clinical trial? Truth be told, the short answer is initially I didn't. I was early diagnosis. I was assured by my oncologist and my surgeon that, of the big group of unlucky people that are diagnosed with this disease, you're one of the luckiest one in that big group because you're early stage 1. Everything's going to be fine. We're going to do a Whipple. We're going to cut it out. You're going to go home and have the standard of care treatment, gemcitabine radiation, and consider yourself lucky that you dodged a bullet. Then the pathology reports came back. And if I recall, my surgeon on the phone said, well, it turns out you're stage 2 T3N1, which is fancy words for I had lymph node involvement. And as Rob said, to his point, that really got my attention. I said, well, what does that mean? He says, well, pretty much that this little booger is more aggressive than I thought. And I sat back in the chair, and at that very moment, I was convinced that I am not going to go for the standard of care. I knew enough at that time. This is not a disease to be trifled with. And I was going to bring out every possible baseball bat I could get. And that's not the standard of care. That was for me. Some people are comfortable with that. For me, it was not. I was going for a clinical trial. At that point, I didn't know where or how or which one that it was, but that's how it started for me.
Got it. And one thing I would love to ask both of you is actually, maybe what was one of the most unexpected things for each of you in participating in a clinical trial? And Randy, I'll start with you.
Well, as far as starting in the clinical trial, first it was finding the clinical trial. That was the most daunting task for me. Once I got started in a clinical trial, it was, okay, I got a job to do. But finding the clinical trial was, it wasn't easy. I mean, it was start with the surgeon, then you go to your oncologist, you pull in every resource that you have. Of course, you hammer the internet. I started with National Institute of Health and looked around and found those various treatment protocols that I felt were good. For me, I thought FOLFIRINOX, kind of a new kid on the block at the time, was something I wanted to go after. Immunotherapy, absolutely. And let's go for targeted radiation, not whole body radiation. I want to go for targeted radiation. And as it turns out, I found the clinical trial for me at Johns Hopkins, and it had all three of those components. It only had 15 people in the trial. The first 7, for whatever reason, dropped out of the trial. I was patient number 8. And I walked in and I said, I will be your first data point. And I was. And here I am 8 years later.
Wow. Rob, what about you?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, slightly different path, but actually the trial I ended up participating in was one that my surgeon recommended. So he was involved with a particular trial and suggested that this might be appropriate for me. What I did, and again, so at the time I was working in pharma R&D, so I had a pretty good network of connections and contacts, and I vetted the trial with them and got their opinions on the trial. I talked to radiation oncologists, I talked to oncologists, and I was surprised. I'd say the bulk of the people encouraged me not to participate in the trial. And I think the rationale was basically, look, they caught it early, you're Whipple eligible, we think you should just go in, get it cut out, and then go on with whatever treatment you can get. And I sort of decided not to do that. And it wasn't probably a very technical reason for it, but when I sort of thought about it, it was really that if I went and got it cut out, and as Randy will attest to, the recovery time associated with a Whipple surgery can be like 2 months long. And I was worried that you go in, you cut it out, and then there's 2 months where nothing's happening. And perhaps if they didn't get every little bit out, there would be fragments in there that might grow and spread and do whatever. And part of this trial was really to have a round of chemo first. So I thought that, okay, well, let's sort of, make it harder for the cancer to spread, and then do the Whipple, and then go on with the subsequent treatment. So that was sort of my rationale for, say, ignoring the advice of a lot of very knowledgeable people. They weren't against the trial, but it was more to Randy's point, hey, you're lucky, it's early, take care of it, cut it out. I think today, Erika, my approach might be a little bit different, just from what I've seen and experienced. So I think there are a lot better search capabilities for finding trials, whether they're through advocacy groups, whether they're online tools that can help sort of find the right people. I would make sure I get a an oncologist sort of on my core team very early to help advise me and sort of have conversations about what might be best for me. I would probably also look to, people who are somehow connected to research or academic type institutions who are more aware of the current progress that's being made. And then finally, when seeking where to do it, and I know Randy and I are quite aligned on this, we'd both be looking for, a multidisciplinary clinical approach.
Yeah.
I would back that up in spades. This is a disease not to be trifled with, and while you may love your local oncologist, you may love your local surgeon. For example, my surgeon was trained under Dr. John Cameron at Johns Hopkins. John Cameron modified the Whipple that goes back to the 30s. I mean, when I first heard of the Whipple, I said, what do you mean? Some toilet paper salesman is going to do a surgery on me? Are you kidding me? This doesn't make any sense. But my surgeon did 700 odd Whipples. The number one surgeon in the world, Dr. John Cameron, now retired, did like 2,000. Number two guy did like 1,500. The number three guy is in the low hundreds. You need to find experts that this is what they live for. And that is found at multidisciplinary clinics. There are several throughout the United States. These are people who focus in on this disease. It's your best first stop.
Yeah. And I know that both of you are patient advocates with the Canopy Cancer Collective, and so I would also love to hear from both of you, which I think you've kind of all both touched on. But I guess let me say it another way. If I'm a patient who's on the fence about whether to apply or whether I should participate if I'm accepted, I guess for each of you, what would you say to them?
So I guess I would take a sort of a step back and let me sort of paint a little bit of the picture for what a patient has to sort of deal with, right? So I think one of the first things I would be suggesting is that the patient should be exploring clinical trials everywhere, not necessarily those that are just connected with either the doctor they're seeing or the institute they're visiting, but you really need to sort of scan everywhere and find the right clinical trial for you. Now, there might be reasons you can't participate. It might be across, the other side of the US. There might be logistical reasons, work-related reasons, but I'm a firm believer in let's find the best clinical trial that will meet my needs, and then I need to figure out if I want to do it and if I can do it. A second area that I think I would look at is, that when you're on a trial, you're presented with something called an informed consent form, and that's where the company or whoever's running the trial sort of outlines for the patient what's going to happen. It gives us sort of the overview of the schedule of the treatments, the appointments, how often you're going to need to be there. It will talk about some of the potential benefits. It will talk about some of the risks associated with participating on that trial. And it will really outline for the patient sort of their responsibility throughout the duration of the clinical trial. But one thing you also might see is the word placebo. And I just sort of want to bring this up quickly and just point out that for oncology trials, placebo does not mean sort of a sugar pill, right? In other trials, people think of it as a sugar pill, and that would dissuade me initially from wanting to participate at all. In oncology, it's really, you're either receiving the current standard of care or you're receiving that plus whatever they're trying to test. So it's not like you're going in getting nothing. You will always be receiving, the highest level of care that you can get. And I think that's an important thing for people to have in their minds as they go through and sort of try to make the decision. And ultimately, it's a decision that the patient needs to drive with his or her family. You need to look, though, beyond just purely the medical, because the way I describe it is I want to make an informed decision. and not just be informed of the trial. I want to know that, yes, this is the right trial for me. Yes, I've thought about the medical implications. Yes, I've thought about the non-medical implications, be it the psychosocial aspects, be it the financial aspects, be it the turn my life upside down if that's what I need to do for the trial. So it needs to be sort of a holistic view and a holistic decision made.
Yeah. Randy, we have anything to add? You're muted.
Unmute. How about that? Yeah, I totally agree with Rob. Rob and I work, Erika, as you've mentioned, under a canopy group. It's trying to get these multidisciplinary clinics to work in concert. But finding a clinical trial, for me, I had a slightly different trajectory. I found my clinical trial. Now, Rob's a type A personality. If you haven't picked up on it, so am I. Not everybody is. And that's why we really push, get to a multidisciplinary clinic, ask questions, and understand this. If you are what to expect, you get out of it what you put into it. We push the patients to try to put yourself in the viewpoint of you're a team member. You have the patient, you have the caregiver, you have the care provider. And when you get into that, ask questions, ask more questions, ask even more questions. For Rob and me, there was no choice. I mean, for me, once I heard stage 2 T3N1, I'm going for a clinical trial. I got to get the biggest baseball bats. What to expect? The more that you learn and become a part of that team, the better it's going to be. You're not just the patient, you're part of this team. And don't be afraid to stand up and say, well, why are you doing this to me? What sort of dosages are you giving me and why? Become a participant, not just the patient. What to watch out for? Clinical trials are not necessarily designed to cure the patient if you walk in. Me, I was a home run. I am a home run. Rob's a home run. Is everybody going to be a home run? No. Clinical trials are designed to further the science. This is eating that cow one forkful at a time. But for me and now Rob, we're giving back. And thank you for Let's Win PC for providing both of us the opportunity to be able to move that ball incrementally down the field and help those who will certainly follow. That's about it for that.
Yeah. My final question before we turn things over to Dr. Trevino is, because both of you are advocates, what type of things would you like to see organizations like Let's Win or medical providers do to encourage more patients to take the path that you did and consider clinical trials?
Well, I guess a couple basic things, and I think we've hit on it throughout, right? I mean, one would be just mechanisms to better educate patients and caregivers on clinical trials and the disease, so they can really understand. Again, for me, it's all about making that informed decision. To understand, to make that decision, I need to understand everything, right? I think it'd be tremendous if we could make it easier for patients, but not just patients. I'll also say doctors who might not specialize in pancreatic and be current on everything, to help them find the appropriate trials that meet the specific patient's needs. I think making trials more available and inclusive, right? That we need to reach out and they need to be reflective of the community we live in as a whole, right? And that we, if we need to reach out to underserved participation populations, we absolutely need to do that. I think one last thing that I would suggest is, I would highly encourage establishing what Randy and I have referred to as sort of a buddy system, right? It is invaluable to be able to pick up the phone and talk to someone who has been through this journey, right? And neither one of us are medical doctors. Neither one of us can dispense medical information, but we've been there, we've been in the shoes, and we can relate to the challenge. And we can, ask them to think about things. We can encourage them. We can watch tell them things to watch out for, things they should press back to their doctor and ask. Right. And I think, if we could establish that mechanism more robustly, I think it would help everybody.
Again, I totally agree. I'm looking at your slide here about qualifying for a trial, prior treatment, and so forth. And that brings back to after I got my Whipple, and things are a whirlwind after you're diagnosed with this. Things are a whirlwind. There's so much information out there. You don't know the terminology. You're starting from scratch. When I got down to Johns Hopkins, my particular clinical trial, which I had read, scared me to my toes. My wife was not really, she was scared. But one of the things on my clinical trial was I needed to have these titanium markers that were in the tumor bed to become reference points for the SBRT targeted radiation. My surgeon, having been trained under John Cameron, put them in there because John Cameron said, you're in there, why not put them in? It gives your patient just another potential option. Had I not had those titanium markers, I would not have qualified for that trial. And I'm convinced I would not be around today. But as far as qualifying for the trial and what can you do to encourage patients to do this, here's the way I look at it. You're here today. You're either a caregiver or you're the patient. You're here today and you're facing this deadly disease. And others are going to follow. So why not participate in a clinical trial and help the science move forward so we can assist the doctors to vanquish this beast? And it needs to be vanquished. And lastly, Rob is talking about his disease. I'm talking about my disease. This is a tough thing to do. Every time we have these canopy meetings, every time my wife asks me, why do you participate in this? Why do you pick up the phone and you talk to a caregiver or a patient? And I say, because I'm a survivor and I got to do that. I lost track of how many patients that I've talked to, but it's just like what Rob said. You want to talk to who's the to talk to before you hit the beach on Omaha Beach? You want to talk to the grizzled sergeant that was in Italy. That's the guy you want to talk to. He may not be the expert, but he was there. It's not easy. We have to support ourselves. Rather have dinner with my friends tonight, but we do this. And again, I am thankful to be afforded the opportunity to help out.
Thank you for those insights. And we'll definitely be bringing you back for some Q&A. But now I'd love to switch the conversation over to Dr. Trevino to have some discussion just around the importance of increasing racial and ethnic diversity in clinical trials.
How's everybody doing? Good night.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us this evening. When I was doing your intro, one of the things that was noted is that your research includes a focus on diversity in clinical trials. And to just start the conversation, would actually love to know what got you interested in that as an area of research.
I think it was pretty clear cut for me how we kind of maneuver into the areas of health disparities. I mean, this country is by the year 2050 is going to be just a mix of a population of white, Black, brown, Latino, Afro-Caribbean, you name it. It's going to be an incredibly diverse group. And one of the key things that I was noticing as a physician, as a surgeon, seeing patients come through my clinic was that there was a disparity. We were seeing Blacks, we were seeing whites, but unfortunately at the time, which this was almost a decade ago when I first started to look into this, the majority of Black people's coming into the clinic were already much more advanced than any other race. And it was interesting. And so we had initially thought this was socioeconomic. This could be something to do with patients' inability to get through our door. But when we started to look deeper into the data, not only data within our own institution, but the state as well as the nation, we realized that wasn't the case. Regardless of whether a patient was at the same level of disease, whether they were Black or white or Latino or Latinx, what ended up happening was Black patients did worse. And when we controlled for everything, again, Black patients did worse. And so the idea was that there might be something more than just the barriers that we see for getting a person into a multidisciplinary group a group that has a ton of physicians that only focus on pancreatic cancer. And when we started to look deeper and deeper into the numbers, we started looking deeper and deeper into the ideas that there might be more to it outside of just these barriers. We asked ourselves about biology. Now, I'll stop for a minute and I'll focus in on the idea of biology. And I'll tell you that there's no question in my mind that we're all just a little bit different. And while we all want to be treated equal, we're all different. And so the ancestry components and all the things that you guys are seeing on TV about trying to figure out who you are and what your genetic makeup is and where you're from, what you have, has become the most incredibly important thing, at least in my mind. Because what it's determining is how much of a percentage do we have. And so I make the point that a Latinx patient from Miami is not genetically similar to a Latinx patient from San Diego. The Latinx patient from Miami will come from the Caribbean and will have more African blood, ancestry blood, than a Latino from San Diego. And so it's an interesting thing that we start to look at. And so why does that make, what's the point? Why do we care about that? Well, as we started looking deeper and deeper into these patients with pancreatic cancer, we realized that the genetics amongst them, whether it be part of their whole genes or whether it be part of the mutated components of their tumor, are different than anybody else. And so if you think that we are targeting those genes, those proteins, those differences amongst in these tumors, we have to ask ourselves, along the whole spectrum of disease, if there are differences in the tumor within a patient population, there's also differences within race and ethnicity. Okay, so I can convince you, biologically, we're all different. And at the level of the tumor on the genetic level, we're probably a little bit different too, if not maybe a lot. So why do I care? Why does anybody care? We're still going to treat the patients, right? We're still going to give them the therapies that are out there. Okay, there have been hundreds of clinical trials of pancreatic cancer. I mean, probably thousands since the inception of what we've been doing to treat patients with this horrible disease. And I can tell you that there has been minimal success. But if I tell you that the clinical trials out there, even to date, that only about 8 to 9% of those participants are from Black and Latinx patient populations, we are really skewed on looking at trial development and therapeutic development for the majority of the white patients with this disease. And if you believe what I said earlier, that we are genetically different and we have different tumor markers and different genes and different proteins that might be targetable, we really are not doing much more than targeting the therapies for whites in this country. And that's fine, but we might be throwing away all of the great drugs that could theoretically been very successful in Blacks and Latinx populations. So that's the importance of clinical trials, and that's the importance of participation. And so if you listen to how I stack this argument to a point of saying that we must have more participation from Blacks and Latinx patients in the trials, because we do not want to throw away therapies that might theoretically be so successful in certain patient populations. Again, that might have certain genes that are common or certain mutations that are common amongst Blacks and or Latinx patients. So, and the only way we're going to figure that out is if they're in clinical trials and their development with them. And so that's the key component of the health disparities. That's how I started, and that gives you a little bit of an idea why it's important.
No, definitely. And just building from that, right? Because, I think you laid it out so well, why this is so important. What are some ways that, principal investigators or people who are leading clinical trials can ensure that necessary diversity is actually represented?
So that's a hard question. So for them to assure is difficult, but we can try. So I think there are barriers. There's no question there are barriers. There's some barriers that are socioeconomic, and so yeah, some people can't afford to get to those big institutions. Listen, Hopkins is a great place. It's a great place, but it can be hard for some people to get there. I mean, Hopkins is in the middle of Baltimore, and you would think that they would have the most diverse clinical trials in the country. You would think. So I will tell you that sometimes the doors have to be open, and you have to have an encouragement by the medical oncology group to really bring them in. and bring the patient populations that are around there into the area to be able to do that. And so education, understanding, sensitivity to a person's cultural background, and to some degree, just the face of the medical oncologist. Diversifying the field is also important as well, suggesting the importance of diversification of the physicians that are treating these patients is also incredibly important. So I think the obstacles we can work on is, number one, saying we need to do this. Number two, really pushing toward diversification of the leadership as well as the medical oncology group. And also, to some degree, make those clinical trials accountable for addressing the need for having more Blacks, Latinx, Asians, and what have you in those trials to really represent this country. And currently the NIH, I can tell you, the big empowering components of this country, and even pharmaceutical companies that are really development, have sections just for this, because they know this is an important topic and it must be addressed.
And I believe that there is research out there about the fact that, like, due to the history of racial discrimination and things that we know, like Henrietta Lacks and the Tuskegee experiment, sometimes minority patients may be more reluctant to participate in clinical trials. And I'm throwing you another hard question. But, what are some of the ways that if you have a patient who is reluctant for those reasons, right? How do we get them to consider clinical trials?
I think a lot of patients don't understand the concept, not because they don't want to. I think the idea of clinical trials scares everybody. I think if we would have thought of a better word than clinical trial, it might have been better for us as physicians to get better recruitment. But I think that the key thing is knowledge, is being able to explain to patients. And so you have to explain to them that they're going to get the standard of care plus. You're going to get the therapy that you're planning on getting, but you're going to get something more. You're going to get a little extra. It's kind of like putting the cherry on top of a beautiful sundae, or sprinkles, or more chocolate. I mean, that's the point, is that you're going to get the greatness behind what we give in terms of the standard, but you're going to get something more that's going to be additional. Sometimes it's even the explanation behind the thing. You tell them that this is a trial that we're working on to try to better this disease process, and it might work on you, it might not work on you, but God, we're going to change the world if we can find something. And so empowering patients to understand that they are important and they will make a difference if something is determined. And I think some of the things that we also have to work on are within ourselves. There's also the idea of this bias that we have, this internal bias, that sometimes we'll see a patient who is Black or Latinx, and some physicians, and I will tell you it's there, will not talk about a clinical trial because they fear the fact that those patients will automatically say no based on a historical argument, like you mentioned, with the Henrietta Lacks or the Tuskegee experiments. These are very important topics that have been around for a long time that need to be addressed and out in the open and suggested. Now, how do we overcome those? I mentioned that to some degree. Obviously, empowerment, letting people understand that this is important, but also, again, changing the face that is presented to them. If a Black medical oncologist speaks to a Black family, we know, and the studies have demonstrated patients feel more comfortable with accepting the idea because they feel a bit of trust. They feel that they understand culturally where they're coming from. And nothing against anybody else, but it's just a fact that works in that direction. And so we have to think on multiple levels and train our medical oncology groups how to deal with situations like that, or else we're not going to succeed.
Yeah. Well, with that, I would also love to bring Randy and Rob back to the stage. I think we've had I know for me, like some very informative and also really thought-provoking information shared this evening. So I want to make sure we leave some time for Q&A. And for anyone in the audience, if you have questions for our panel, please put them into the chat. We will aim to get to as many questions as we can. My first question, and any of the three of you feel free to jump in, which is, how can a patient or caregiver find possible clinical trials?
Are you asking Rob and me?
Oh, any of the three of you, whoever wants to jump in. I'm sure you all have a perspective on that, but
Well, I'll
if there are
jump in
resources.
first. I mean, I think back to 8 years ago, and it wasn't easy. There was not PanCan was around. Let's Win PC. I'm not even sure how long Let's Win PC has been around, but the tools that are available on the internet today for a patient or a caregiver or both as a team to be able to find a clinical trial just by doing a quick search on the internet. There are lots of AI programs that can help connect a patient with a potential clinical trial. But Rob and I both know, dealing with these multidisciplinary clinics, it's like this asymptotic curve. Things are getting faster and faster with respect to putting patients together to the right clinical trial. Back 8 years ago, I was with a hammer and a chisel and a stone tablet. It's not that way today. Get together with an MDC, ask questions. What clinical trials do you have? How are you hooking me up with any particular clinical trial that you have? And what about any clinical trials that might be out there in other MDCs? You have to be aggressive. You got to play smart ball with this disease.
Yeah, I mean, I would just build on Randy's point. I mean, I think advocacy groups is certainly a good first point of contact to try to find things. Part of the issue historically has been, if you go out to clinicaltrials.gov, I'll just say, being generous, it's difficult to navigate out there unless you have a PhD or are well vetted in the field. There are other tools though. So for example, there's a tool I'm familiar with called medifine.com, where it will help you find both specialist doctors and rates them via sort of, I'll say, better criteria in terms of, it'll look at the number of times that doctor is consulted for a second opinion, or the number of, articles written or other things. So it gets sort of beyond just sort of, recommendations from patients because they validate parking, so that doctor's good. But it also has a smart front end on top of clinicaltrials.gov, which helps people try to find specific trials that are available and open where they might meet the criteria. So it takes what is a very wide funnel and narrows it down to perhaps a more manageable number of trials that you can have a robust conversation with your doctor about. So to Randy's point, yeah, I mean, every day we're just making more and more progress in the space.
And Dr. Trevino, I'll direct this question to you, which is, can a patient apply to more than one clinical trial?
That's a difficult maneuver, and I'll tell you why. These clinical trials, they have the eligibility criteria. In other words, what you go into. If you go into multiple different clinical trials, you confuse the initial clinical trial, because then you don't know if something worked, what worked. Is it the combination of the two? Was it one? Was it the other? And so, yeah, the answer to that question, unfortunately, is no. And for as much as we'd love to just kind of throw the kitchen sink at somebody and hope that something sticks, it's to our best interest to know what it is that works. And I think that's why we use these clinical trials, and we're so stern about these areas of what it makes you eligible, what doesn't. But I will say this, and I think this has already been somewhat mentioned, and we're producing some research on this, which I hope has a lot of traction in the near future, is that there is a lot of other areas of concern when it comes to eligibility for patients in clinical trials, and that's the criteria. And so I'll tell you that one of the criteria in some clinical trials is having HIV status will exclude you from being able to be part of a clinical trial that might theoretically help you in the long run. Now, HIV 20, 30 years ago was a concern, and it was difficult to manage, maybe even 40 years ago. God, if I remember correctly, it's probably longer than that. But nowadays, it's a disease that's very, very well controlled. And so, but we're still excluding patients from that. And so it's an interesting thing that we have to go back to somewhat the drawing board and say, maybe it's some of these eligibility criteria that we need to be lax on. Diabetes as well. We can manage diabetes. If a person has poorly controlled diabetes, we must work to get it better, as opposed to saying, well, you're poorly controlled, you're not going to be eligible. So all these things are, as I said, are very incredibly important.
So Eric, can I just
Sorry.
build on
Yeah.
Dr. Trevino's point? Because I actually sit with a couple of pharma companies on internal oncology review groups as patients, right? And it's all about trying to get the active voice of the patient involved earlier and earlier as part of research in pharma. And to his point, I mean, we constantly are sort of pushing back and challenging sort of some of the existing underlying assumptions in terms of, okay, well, when you're establishing these inclusion and exclusion criteria, right? Are you really sort of pressing the envelope and being aggressive and being sort of as inclusive as you can possibly be, while still being able to analyze your data and come up with, conclusive results from it, right? So I think companies are a lot more open and they're taking this a lot more seriously than they did in the past. And I'm hoping and expecting that, there's going to be a lot more receptivity in terms of broadening that engagement.
Yeah. Dr. Trevino, I will also direct this question to you, which is, are clinical trials available to a patient that is actively receiving chemotherapy treatments, or is it only available when chemo treatments no longer work?
That's a variation. There are some clinical trials that won't allow you in because you've had prior exposure to chemotherapy. But I think, again, the idea of having a little bit more laxity on clinical trials in terms of participation is important. There are groups out there now that are doing, I think, a phenomenal thing with patients with pancreatic cancer. And so I'll before I say anything on that, I'll just say something about Robert and Randall. They went ahead and they did this, they pursued this, they went through this, but I'll tell you that they're a lucky group. Even stage 2 patients, hell, even stage 1 patients don't make it beyond 5 years. This disease is a biological, it's a conundrum. Whether you have 1 millimeter focus of invasive cancer, or whether you have a 3 centimeter focus of invasive cancer, to some degree, it doesn't matter. That cancer finds a way. And so biology is incredibly important, and knowing your biology is incredibly important. And so knowing this and saying that Mr. Swan and Mr. Welder, they're the key. They're the reasons that Mr. Weker, I'm sorry, they're the key that as to what it is that we did right in the sense of treating this disease, because most patients, even with stage 2 and stage 3, don't live more than 2 or 3 years. Most. They are a select few. I mean, so I'll put it into perspective. 80% of patients don't get offered surgery. Out of those 20%, only about 8-9% will make it beyond 5 years. That's pretty bad. And so you got to think of it in that perspective that this is a horrible disease. Now, in terms of the therapies and combination and things like that, there are some groups that are doing an amazing job understanding this, and they're saying this. Okay, so you get treated with you get initial chemotherapy after surgery for let's say stage 3 disease. You get started. 3 months later, you get recurrence. You get something in your liver. Do you continue the same therapy or do you change it around? Now, most people would say, wait a minute, probably didn't work with the first 3 months on the same therapy. Maybe we should change it around. But back 20, 30 years ago, we used to give the same therapy and we'd watch the tumor progress. Now we're actually saying, no, it's not working. Change it to something else, and then look at it in 6 months. 6 months later, it's still progressing, change it again, and change it again. And along the way, biopsying those tumors to see what biology is focusing on. And so there are some clinical trials that are very focused on one drug, and they don't want you to add anything else along the way. But there are some now that are saying we should develop the clinical trials to really understand the disease process and change it around as you're progressing through the disease. So it's, again, very variable. And this is the importance of knowing clinical trials and going out there and understanding them and focusing on what's going to be best for you with the literature that's out there and working with your medical oncologist, surgical oncologist, and your multidisciplinary group.
And if I could just break in, Dr. Trevino, you make an excellent point. This is a game, and not a game in the fun sort of way. This is not a fun game at all, but this is a game of variables. And these clinical trials are all about variables. The simplest equation you can solve is 2 + x = 4. What's x? Well, x = 2. I mean, I kind of get that, but this is such a complicated analysis that the trial researchers are looking at. The question is I'm reading this, is clinical trials Are clinical trials available to a patient that is actively receiving chemo treatments or only when chemo treatments no longer work? That's kind of an open-ended question. My particular clinical trial, I walked in, this particular clinical trial that I got accepted to said no neoadjuvant therapy. It said you had to be stage 1 or stage 2. You had to have a Whipple procedure within 30 days after initial diagnosis, and you have to start this clinical trial within 4 weeks after that. It was very, very narrow criteria because the clinical researchers were looking to try to answer, well, what if in the future we have an early diagnosis tool and we get somebody with a blood test that says, oh, you got pancreatic cancer. We can't see the tumor, but we know you got it. We want to come up with a potential treatment protocol that can treat it. So therefore, we don't want any initial therapy. Today, the standard down at Johns Hopkins is, oh, you're stage 1, stage 2. We're gonna treat you with chemotherapy up front, and then we're gonna go do a Whipple procedure. Let's go out to, as Rob mentioned, to his point, and I was concerned with this and say, you know what, I am waiting. I mean, my GI guy said, well, sometime, in the next couple, he wasn't that lackadaisical about it. He says, certainly you have to stent in, and within the next 2 to 3 months, you're going to want to get a Whipple. I went home thinking, no way, I'm going to get a Whipple right away. I need to get this thing out of here, and I need to treat this aggressively right away. The point being that the criteria changes. Get to the MDC. I got to hit that again because that's what we're looking at with the canopy. You got to get to the MDC. This science changes constantly. And Dr. Trevino, I'm sure that you agree with that. You just mentioned about, well, you try this for 6 months, and if that doesn't work, you got to try something else. You got to hit this disease from every way that you can, and the game changes. And it's unfortunate, but the rules are changing with this disease. So excellent points.
I want to try to get to one more question before we wrap up for this evening. And this question is for Rob and Randy. The question is, do either of you have DNA mutations that increase your cancer risk? And if so, has that been of any use in your treatment thus far?
So I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think the answer is no, not that I know of. Though that being said, having had cancer 3 times, I think something's screwed up in there somewhere. And it's interesting because I personally believe that, I got pancreatic cancer as a result of previous radiation treatments from earlier cancers. So if you look at research, you can sort of find in footnotes places where they sort of identify that there might be some kind of linkage there. So no, I don't know, but I know there are groups out there, like I know PanCan, for example, has a Know Your Tumor program. And to Dr. Trevino's point, it's all about really getting knowledgeable about the biology, right? Because that biology might provide insight, it might not, but the more we know, the better equipped we are to try to find the right path for an answer.
Well, and again, I would agree with that. Rob and I agree with each other a lot during the time that we've known each other. For me, my particular tumor was, for whatever reason, I asked about DNA mutations. Well, your tumor was pretty diffuse, and we got it into the path lab, and we were not able to do any sort of analysis like that. With many cancers, all cancers, diseases, there's a genetic component to it. There's an environmental component to it. I'm an ex-Navy nuclear submarine officer. My wife says, aha, it's because you were on nuclear submarines. That's why you got pancreatic cancer. Who knows? Should we investigate things like that? Yes, of course. But it's not just DNA. I mean, sometimes it's just the luck of the draw. Is there something in my genetic makeup? I have no history of cancer in my family, 0. So could it be nuclear submarines? I don't know. But I can't waste the time thinking about that.
Yeah, really quickly, Dr. Trevino, because I am not familiar. Is there any current guidance for individuals who have been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer as to whether they should undergo testing for, BRCA 1 and 2 mutations or Lynch syndrome mutation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so there's actually a lot of groups that are doing that now for all surgically resected specimens. I mean, where I came from at the University of Florida, we were pretty much on your tumor as it came out. I mean, we weren't doing a whole exome sequencing where we were looking at all the genes that were there. We were looking at specific ones that were very commonly expressed because, again, if we figure out the mutated components, there are targeted therapies for that. There are certain drugs that affect certain mutations better, tumors with mutations better than others. And so, yeah, it makes sense. It's a lot of groups are doing that all around the country. And I think not only just for research purposes, but also for therapeutic purposes. And so it's incredibly important. And to everybody's point today, and I'm not sure if it was it was Mr. Swan or Mr. Weker's point that you want to go to a place that does this a lot. And what I tell patients is this: would you take your brand new 2021 BMW to the corner shop to get looked at, your engine looked at? Probably not, right? You take it to the BMW dealers, a BMW 2021. That's where you want to be. You want to go to the place that does it all the time and thinks about this disease day in and day out. Those are incredibly great points. Because again, these places are the ones that'll say, let's look a little further. Let's look into the tumor. Let's look into the genes. Let's see if there's a mutation that we might be able to use as a therapeutic guide to address the disease. And so,
yeah. Well, so Dr. Trevino, Rob, Randy, thank you so much for being with us this evening. I thought this was so informative. I just want to quickly say as we wrap up this evening, Let's Win actually has 2 videos that are a resource to help patients and caregivers better understand clinical trials as well as how to find them. You can currently see them on the slide. As I think has been repeatedly stressed throughout this evening, clinical trials are such an important part of the pancreatic cancer treatment process. You should always, talk to your treating physician. But in addition, some resources that we have up here on the screen to find clinical trials are clinicaltrials.gov. Let's Win has a clinical trial finder. PanCan has a resource, as well as Cancer Commons. And the links to these organizations, as well as the 2 previous videos I mentioned, will be sent out to attendees along with a recording of this webinar. So thank you again to our panelists for coming and sharing such important information. And thank you to Let's Win for putting this together.
thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Dr. Trevino, thank you for sharing your wisdom. Randy and Rob, for sharing your stories and for really being an ambassador for the pancreatic cancer community. And Erika, for just being you and for all you do to help patients and families really in the fight against preventing and getting the best treatment. So thank you. And as Erika mentioned before we wrap up, there are a lot of resources. We're really, really here to help you and help families navigate this very challenging disease. The 2 animations on our site, what is a clinical trial and how to find a clinical trial, are really, really helpful. And then, there are tremendous resources in helping families navigate trials at Emerging Med, at PanCan's Clinical Trial Finder, and our friends at Cancer Commons who help navigate a virtual tumor board. So we're here to help. Thank you. We will send out links to all of this. We hope that you will continue to participate in our Let's Win Learn series. And I hope that everybody has a good night. Thanks again. Bye now.